Sonia drove in from Colorado Springs on Saturday evening, and as we huddled in the living room over glasses of Pepsi, I filled her in on the rest of what Colton had said. "What have we been missing?" I wondered out loud. "I don't know," she said. "It's like he just pops out with new information all of a sudden. I want to know more, but I don't know what to ask him." We were both teachers, Sonia in the formal sense and I in the pastoral sense. We agreed that the best way to proceed was just to keep asking open-ended questions as the situation presented itself, and not fill in any blanks for Colton as I had inadvertently when I suggested the word crown when Colton was describing the gold thing on Jesus' head. In the coming years, we would stick to that course so carefully that Colton didn't know the word sash until he was 10 years old. A couple of days after the conversation about the markers on Jesus' hands and feet, I was sitting at the kitchen table preparing for a sermon, and Colton was playing nearby. I looked up from my books and over at my son, who was armed with plastic swords and in the process of tying the corners of a towel around his neck. Every superhero needs a cape. I knew I wanted to ask him about heaven again and had been turning over possible questions in my mind. I had never had a conversation like this with Colton before, so I was a little nervous about how to begin. In fact, I had never had a conversation like this with anyone before. Trying to catch him before he actually did battle, I got Colton's attention and motioned him to come sit with me. He trotted over and climbed into the chair at the end of the kitchen table. "Yes? Remember when you were telling me what Jesus looks like and about the horse?" He nodded, eyes wide and earnest. "You were in heaven?" He nodded again. I realized I was starting to accept that, yes, maybe Colton really had been to heaven. I felt like our family had received a gift, and having just peeled back the top layer of tissue paper, knew its general shape. Now I wanted to know what was in the box. "Well, what did you do in heaven?" I ventured. "Homework." Homework? That wasn't what I was expecting. Choir practice, maybe, but homework? "What do you mean?" I asked. Colton smiled. "Jesus was my teacher." "Like school?" Colton nodded. "Jesus gave me work to do, and that was my favorite part of heaven. There were lots of kids, Dad." This statement marked the beginning of a period that I wished we had written down. During this conversation and for the next year or so, Colton could name a lot of the kids he said were in heaven with him. He doesn't remember their names now, though, and neither do Sonia nor I. This was also the first time Colton had mentioned other people in heaven. I mean, other than Bible figures like John the Baptist. But I have to admit that I sort of thought of him as, well, a character more than a regular person like you and me. It sounds kind of dumb since Christians talk all the time about going to heaven when we die. Why wouldn't I expect that Colton would have seen ordinary people? But all I could think to ask was, so what did the kids look like? What do people look like in heaven? "Everybody's got wings," Colton said. "Wings, huh? Did you have wings?" I asked. "Yeah, but mine weren't very big." He looked a little glum when he said this. "Okay, did you walk places or did you fly?" "We flew. Well, all except for Jesus. He was the only one in heaven who didn't have wings. Jesus just went up and down like an elevator." The book of Acts flashed into my head, the scene of Jesus' ascension, when Jesus told the disciples that they would be his witnesses, that they would tell people all over the world about him. After he said this, the scripture says Jesus was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. Jesus went up and will come down without wings. To a kid, that could look like an elevator. Colton broke into my thoughts. Everyone kind of looks like angels in heaven, Dad. What do you mean? All the people have a light above their head. I racked my brain for what I knew about angels and light. In the Bible, when angels show up, they're sometimes dazzling bright, blinding almost. When Mary Magdalene and the other women showed up outside Jesus' tomb on the third day after he was buried, the Gospels say that an angel met them sitting on the tombstone that had somehow been rolled away. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. I remembered that the book of Acts talks about the disciple Stephen. As he was being accused of heresy before a Jewish court, they saw that his face became as bright as an angel's, not long after Stephen was stoned to death. The Apostle John in the book of Revelation wrote that he saw a mighty angel coming down from heaven surrounded by a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and that the angel's face shone like the sun. I couldn't remember angels having lights over their heads specifically, or halos as some would call them. But I also knew that Colton's experience of angels in storybooks and scripture did not include lights over angels' heads. And he didn't even know the word halo. I don't know that he'd ever seen one, since our bedtime stories and the Sunday school lessons at church are closely aligned with scripture. Still, what he said intrigued me for another reason. A friend of ours, the wife of a pastor at a church in Colorado, had once told me about something her daughter, Hannah, said when she was 3 years old. After the morning service was over one Sunday, Hannah tugged on her mom's skirt and asked, "Mommy, why do some people in church have lights over their heads and some don't?" At the time, I remember thinking two things. First, I would have knelt down and asked Hannah, "Did I have a light over my head? Please say yes." I also wondered what Hannah had seen and whether she had seen it before. Like my son, she had a childlike faith. The disciples asked Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a child from the crowd, had the child stand among them as an example. "I tell you the truth," Jesus said, "unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Whoever humbles himself like this child. What is childlike humility? It's not the lack of intelligence, but the lack of guile, the lack of an agenda. It's that precious, fleeting time before we have accumulated enough pride or position to care about what others might think. The same unself-conscious honesty that enables a 3-year-old to splash joyfully in a rain puddle or tumble laughing into the grass with a puppy, or point out loudly that various hygiene matters are being overlooked in people around them. It is this kind of lack of self-reliance, this kind of open, honest God-reliance that is required to enter heaven. It is the opposite of ignorance. It is intellectual honesty, to be willing to accept reality and call things what they are, even when it is hard. All this flashed through my mind in an instant, but I remained non-committal. "A light, huh?" was all I said. "Yeah, they have yellow from here to here," he said, making the sash motion again, left shoulder to right hip. "And white from here to here." He placed his hands on his shoulders and bent forward and touched the tops of his feet. I thought of the man who appeared to the prophet Daniel on the 24th day of the first month. As I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of the finest gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze. Colton then made the sash motion again and said that people in heaven wore different colors there than the angels did. By now, my new information meter was nearly pegged, but there was one more thing I had to know. If Colton really had been to heaven and really had seen all these things, Jesus, horses, angels, other children, and was up there, was it up long enough to do homework? How long had he left his body, as he claimed? I looked at him kneeling in the kitchen chair with his towel cape still tied around his neck. Colton, you said you were in heaven and you did all these things, a lot of things. How long were you gone? My little boy looked me right in the eye and didn't hesitate. 3 minutes, he said. Then he hopped down from the chair and skipped off to play. 3 minutes. As Colton began to set up for an epic plastic sword fight with an unseen villain, I marveled at his answer. He had already authenticated his experience by telling me things he could not otherwise have known. But now I had to square his answer 3 minutes with all the rest. I stared down at my Bible, lying open on the kitchen table, and turned over the possibilities in my mind. 3 minutes. It wasn't possible that Colton could have seen and done everything he described so far in just 3 minutes. Of course, he wasn't old enough to tell time yet, so maybe his sense of 3 actual minutes wasn't the same as an adult's. Like most parents, I was pretty sure Sonia and I weren't helping that issue, promising to be off the phone, for example, or finished talking in the yard with a neighbor, or done in the garage in 5 more minutes and then wrapping it up 20 minutes later. It was also possible that time in heaven doesn't track with time on earth. The Bible says that with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years are like a day. Some interpret that as a literal exchange, as in 2 days equals 2,000 years. But I've always taken it to mean that God operates outside of our understanding of time. Time on earth is keyed to a celestial clock governed by the solar system. But the Bible says there is no sun in heaven because God is the light there. Maybe there is no time in heaven, at least not as we understand it. On the other hand, Colton's 3 minutes answer was as straight up and matter of fact as if he'd told me he'd had Lucky Charms for breakfast. As far as our clock goes, he could have been right. For him to leave his body and return to it, he couldn't have been gone long, especially since we'd never received any kind of report saying Colton had ever been clinically dead. In fact, the post-operative report was clear that even though our son's prognosis had been grim, the surgery had gone just fine. The operative report reads, operative date 3/5/2003, pre-operative diagnosis, acute appendicitis, post-operative diagnosis, perforated appendicitis and abscess, operation, appendectomy and drainage of abscess, surgeon, Timothy O'Halloran, MD. Description of the operation: the patient was placed in a supine position on the operating table. Under general anesthesia, the abdomen was prepped and draped in a sterile fashion. The transverse incision was made in the right lower quadrant and carried down through all layers of the peritoneal cavity. The patient had a perforated appendix with an abscess. The appendix was delivered up in the operative field. A thought hit me like a brick. Colton didn't die. How could he have gone to heaven if he didn't die? A couple of days passed as I chewed on that. It had only been a week or so since Colton first told us about the angels, so I didn't want to keep pushing the heaven issue. But finally, I couldn't stand it anymore and hunted the house for Colton until I found him. Down on his knees in the bedroom, we'd converted to a playroom, building a tower of Legos. I leaned in the door frame and got his attention. "Hey, Colton, I don't understand," I began. He looked up at me and I noticed for the first time that All the roundness had returned to his face. His cheeks filled out and rosy again after his illness had drained them thin and sallow. "What? You said you went to heaven. People have to die to go to heaven." Colton's gaze didn't waver. "Well, okay then, I died, but just for a little bit." My heart skipped a beat. If you haven't heard your preschooler tell you he was dead, I don't recommend it. But Colton hadn't died. I knew what the medical record said. Colton had never ceased breathing. His heart had never stopped. I stood in the doorway and mulled over this new tidbit as Colton returned his attention to his toys. Then I remembered that the Bible talks in several places about people who had seen heaven without dying. The Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth about a Christian he knew personally who was taken to heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not able to tell. It is generally thought that St. Paul is referring to himself here in the third person. Then, of course, there was John the Apostle, who described heaven in great detail in the book of Revelation. John had been exiled to the island of Patmos, where an angel visited him and commanded him to write down a series of prophecies to various churches. John wrote, "After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had heard first speaking to me like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne." Rainbows. Now, where had I heard that recently? As I stood there and thought about a scriptural basis for experiencing heaven without dying, I realized that Colton, in telling me he had died for a little bit, had only been trying to match up his pastor dad's assertion with what he knew to be the facts of his own experience. Kind of like walking outside and finding that the street is wet and concluding, well, okay, it must have rained. See, I had this tidy little box that said, people have to die to go to heaven. And Colton, trusting me, concluded, well, I must have died then, because I was there. Suddenly he piped up again. "Daddy, remember when I yelled for you in the hospital when I waked up?" How could I forget? It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "Of course I do," I said. "Well, the reason I was yelling was that Jesus came to get me. He said I had to go back because he was answering your prayer. That's how come I was yelling for you." Suddenly, my knees felt weak underneath me. I flashed back to my prayers alone, raging, yelling at God, and my prayers in the waiting room, quiet and desperate. I remembered how scared I was, agonizing over whether Colton would hang on through the surgery, whether he'd live long enough for me to see his precious face again. Those were the longest, darkest 90 minutes of my life. And Jesus answered my prayer personally after I had yelled at God, chastising him, questioning his wisdom and his faithfulness. Why would God even answer a prayer like that? The first weeks of July burned into the plains, nurturing the cornfields with all the heat of a giant greenhouse. Wedgwood, blue skies arced over Imperial almost every day, the air buzzing with mosquitoes in the sunshine and singing with crickets by starlight. Around the middle of July, I drove over to Greeley, Colorado for the Church District Conference. The gathering of about 150 pastors, pastors' wives, and delegates from Nebraska and Colorado was meeting at the church pastored by Steve Wilson, the same church I'd visited back in March, while Sonia stayed back at the Harris's home nursing Colton when we all thought he had a stomach flu. Roman Catholics practice confession as a sacrament, sharing their sins and shortcomings with a priest. Protestants practice confession too, though a little less formally, often confiding in God without an intermediary. But Colton's recent revelation that my raging prayers had ascended directly to heaven and had received an equally direct response made me feel like I had some additional confessing to do. I didn't feel good about having been so angry with God. When I was so upset, burning with anger that he was about to take my child, guess who was holding my child? Guess who was loving my child unseen? As a pastor, I felt accountable to other pastors for my own lack of faith. So at Greeley Wesleyan, during the conference, I asked Phil Harris, our district superintendent, if I could have a few minutes to share. He agreed, and when the time came, I stood up before my peers in the sanctuary that on Sunday mornings held around 1,000 people in its pews. After delivering a brief update on Colton's health, I thanked these pastors and their wives for their prayers on behalf of our family. Then I began my confession. Most of you know that before everything happened with Colton, I had broken my leg and gone through the kidney stone operation, then the lumpectomy. I had had such a bad year that some people had started calling me Pastor Job. The sanctuary echoed with gentle laughter. But none of that stuff hurt like watching what Colton was going through. And I got really mad at God. I continued, I'm a guy. Guys do something. And all I felt like I could do was yell at God. I described briefly my attitude in that little room in the hospital, blasting God, blaming him for Colton's condition, whining about how he had chosen to treat one of his pastors as though I should somehow be exempt from troubles because I was doing his work. At that time, when I was so upset and so outraged, can you believe that God chose to answer that prayer? I said. Can you believe that I could pray a prayer like that and God would still answer it yes? What had I learned? I was reminded yet again that I could be real with God, I told my fellow pastors. I learned that I didn't have to offer some kind of churchy, holy-sounding prayer in order to be heard in heaven. You might as well tell God what you think, I said. He already knows it anyway. Most importantly of all, I learned that I am heard. We all are. I had been a Christian since childhood and a pastor for half my life, so I believed that before, but now I knew it. How? As the nurses wheeled my son away, screaming, Daddy, Daddy, don't let them take me. When I was angry at God because I couldn't go to my son, hold him, and comfort him, God's son was holding my son in his lap. On a sun-drenched day in August, 4-year-old Colton hopped into the passenger seat of my red pickup, and the two of us headed off to Benkelman. I had to drive out there to bid on a job and decided to take Colton with me. He wasn't particularly interested in the installation of industrial-sized garage doors, but he loved riding in my little Chevy diesel because, unlike the Expedition, where he had a limited view from the back seat, his car seat rode high in the Chevy and he could see everything. Benkelman is a small farming town 38 miles due south of Imperial. Incorporated in 1887, it's fraying a bit at the edges, like a lot of communities in rural Nebraska. Its population declining as technology eats up agricultural jobs and people move to bigger cities in search of work. I steered past the familiar fertilizer and potato plants that rise at the east end of Imperial, then turned south toward Enders Lake. We drove by the cedar-dotted municipal golf course on our left, and then, as we passed over a concrete dam, the lake sparkled below on our right. Colton looked down at the speedboat towing a skier in its foamy wake. We crossed the dam, dipped down into a valley, and motored up onto the stretch of a 2-lane highway that points straight south. Now acres of farmland fanned out around us, cornstalks 6 feet high, bright green against the sky, and asphalt cutting through it like a blade. Suddenly, Colton spoke up. "Dad, you had a grandpa named Pop, didn't you?" "Yep, sure did," I said. "Was he your mommy's daddy or your daddy's daddy?" "Pop was my mom's dad. He passed away when I was not much older than you." Colton smiled. "He's really nice." I almost drove off the road into the corn. It's a crazy moment when your son uses the present tense to refer to someone who died a quarter century before he was even born. But I tried to stay cool. "So, you saw Pop?" I said. "Yeah, I got to stay with him in heaven." "You were really close to him, huh, Dad?" "Yes, I was all I could manage. My head spun. Colton had just introduced a whole new topic: people you've lost and meeting them in heaven. Crazily enough, with all the talk of Jesus and angels and horses, I had never even thought to ask him if he'd met anyone I might know. But then, why would I? We hadn't lost any family or friends since Colton was born, so who would there have been for him to meet? Now this. I probably drove another 10 miles toward Benkelman, thoughts charging through my mind. Soon the cornfields were broken by neat squares of bronzed stubble, wheat fields past the harvest. I didn't want to make the same mistake I'd made when I put ideas in his head that people had to die, for example, before being admitted to heaven. I didn't want him just feeding me back stuff to please me. I wanted to know the truth. On the left, a quarter mile off the road, a white church steeple seemed to rise from the corn. St. Paul's Lutheran Church, built in 1918. I wondered what the people of this long-standing local fixture would think of the things our little boy had been telling us. Finally, as we crossed into Dundee County, I was ready to start asking some open-ended questions. "Hey, Colton," I said. He turned from the window where he'd been watching a pheasant pacing amid the cornrows. "What?" "Colton, what did Pop look like?" He broke into a big grin. "Oh, Dad, Pop has really big wings." Again, with the present tense. It was weird. Colton went on. "My wings were really little, but Pop's were big." "What did his clothes look like?" "He had white on, but blue here," he said, making the sash motion again. I edged the truck over to avoid a ladder someone had dropped in the road and then steered back to the center of the lane. "And you got to stay with Pop?" Colton nodded. His eyes seemed to light up. "When I was a little boy," I said, "I had a lot of fun with Pop." I didn't tell Colton why I spent so much time with Pop and my Grandma Ellen on their farm in Ulysses, Kansas. The sad truth was that my dad, a chemist who worked for Kara McGee Petroleum, suffered from bipolar disorder. Sometimes when his episodes got bad enough, my mom, Kay, an elementary school teacher, had to put Dad in the hospital. She sent me to Pop's to shield me from that. I didn't know I was being shipped away. I just knew I loved roaming the farm, chasing chickens, and hunting rabbits. "I spent a lot of time with Pop at their place out in the country," I said to Colton. "I rode on the combine and the tractor with him. He had a dog and we'd take him out and hunt rabbits." Colton nodded again. "Yeah, I know. Pop told me." Well, I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the dog's name was Charlie Brown, and he had one blue eye and one brown one. "Cool," Colton said. "Can we get a dog like that?" I chuckled. "We'll see." My grandfather, Lawrence Barber, was a farmer and one of those people who knew everyone and whom everyone considered a friend. He started most of his days before dawn, beating it from his farmhouse in Ulysses, Kansas, down to the local donut shop to swap stories. He was a big guy. He played fullback in the days before the pass. His wife, my Grandma Ellen, the same grandma who sent money to help with Colton's hospital bills, used to say it would take 4 or 5 tacklers to bring Lawrence Barber down. Pop was a guy who went to church only once in a while. He was kind of private about spiritual things, the way a lot of men tend to be. I was about 6 years old when he died after driving off the road late one night. Pop's Crown Victoria hit a power pole, cracking it in half. The top of the pole keeled over and smashed into the Crown Victoria's roof, but the car's momentum carried Pop another half-mile into a field. The accident knocked out the power at a feed yard a little way back in the direction Pop had come from, prompting a worker there to investigate. Pop was apparently alive and breathing right after the accident because the rescue workers found him stretched across the passenger seat, reaching for the door handle and trying to escape from the car. But when he arrived by ambulance at the hospital, doctors pronounced him dead. He was only 61 years old. I remember seeing my mother in anguish at the funeral, but her grief didn't end there. As I got older, I'd sometimes catch her in prayer with tears gently sliding down her cheeks. When I asked her what was wrong, she would share with me, "I'm worried about whether Pop went to heaven." We didn't find out until much later, in 2006, from my Aunt Connie, about a special service Pop had attended only 2 days before his death, a service that might hold answers to my grandfather's eternal destiny. The date was July 13th, 1975, and the place was Johnson, Kansas. Mom and Aunt Connie had an uncle named Hubert Caldwell. I liked Uncle Hubert. Not only was Hubert a simple country preacher, but he loved to talk and was the type who was easy to talk to. I also enjoyed Hubert because he was shorter than me. Looking down to visit with anyone happens so rarely for me that even the opportunity feels like a privilege. Uncle Hubert had invited Pop, Connie, and many others to revival services he was leading in his little country church. From behind his pulpit at the Church of God of Apostolic Faith, Hubert closed his message by asking if anyone wanted to give his life to Christ. Uncle Hubert saw Pop raise his hand, but somehow that story never made it back to my mom, and she worried about it off and on for the next 28 years. After we got home from Benkelman, I called my mom and told her what Colton had said. That was on a Friday. The next morning, she pulled into our driveway, having made the trip all the way from Ulysses to hear what her grandson had to say about her dad. It surprised us how quickly she arrived. "Boy, she beelined it up here," Sonia said. Around the dinner table that evening, Sonia and I listened as Colton told his grandma about Jesus' rainbow horse and spending time with Pop. The thing that surprised Mom most was the way Colton told the story. Pop had recognized his great-grandson even though Colton was born decades after Pop died. That got Mom wondering whether those who have gone ahead of us know what's happening on Earth. Or is it that in heaven we'll know our loved ones, even those we didn't get to meet in life, by some next life way of knowing we don't enjoy on Earth? Then Mom asked Colton an odd question. "Did Jesus say anything about your dad becoming a pastor?" Just as I was wondering privately why in the world something like my vocation would even come up, Colton surprised me when he nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, Jesus said he went to Daddy and told him he wanted Daddy to be a pastor, and Daddy said yes, and Jesus was really happy." I just about fell out of my chair. That was true, and I vividly remember the night it happened. I was 13 years old and attending a summer camp at John Brown University in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. At one of the evening meetings, Reverend Orville Butcher delivered a message about how God calls people to ministry and uses them to do his work all over the world. Pastor Butcher was a short, bald, lively preacher, energetic and engaging, not dull and dry the way kids sometimes expect an older pastor to be. He challenged the group of 150 teenagers that night. "There are some of you here tonight whom God could use as pastors and missionaries." The memory of that moment of my life is one of those crystal clear ones, distilled and distinct, like the moment you graduate from high school or your first child is born. I remember that the crowd of kids faded away and the Reverend's voice receded into the background. I felt a pressure in my heart, almost a whisper. "That's you, Todd. That's what I want you to do." There was no doubt in my mind that I had just heard from God. I was determined to obey. I tuned back into Pastor Butcher just in time to hear him say that if any of us had heard from God that night, if any of us had made a commitment to serve him in ministry, we should tell someone about it when we got home so that at least one other person would know. When I got home from camp, I walked into the kitchen. "Mom," I said, "when I grow up, I'm going to be a pastor." Since that day, decades before, Mom and I had revisited that conversation a couple of times, but we had never told Colton about it. As the green days of summer gave way to a fiery fall, we talked with Colton about heaven every now and then. But one running conversation did emerge. When Colton saw Jesus in heaven, what did he look like? The reason for the frequency of this particular topic was that as a pastor, I wound up spending a lot of time at hospitals, in Christian bookstores, and at other churches, all places where there are lots of drawings and paintings of Christ. Often Sonia and the kids were with me, so it became sort of a game. When we came across a picture of Jesus, we'd ask Colton, "What about this one? Is that what Jesus looks like?" Invariably, Colton would peer for a moment at the picture and shake his tiny head. "No, the hair's not right," he would say, or "the clothes aren't right." This would happen dozens of times over the next 3 years, whether it was a poster in a Sunday school room, a rendering of Christ on a book cover, or a reprint of an old master's painting hanging on the wall of an old folks' home. Colton's reaction was always the same. He was too young to articulate exactly what was wrong with every picture, he just knew they weren't right. One evening in October, I was sitting at the kitchen table working on a sermon. Sonia was around the corner in the living room, working on the business books, processing job tickets and sorting through payables. Cassie playing with dolls at her feet. I heard Colton's footsteps padding up the hallway and caught a glimpse of him circling the couch, where he then planted himself directly in front of Sonia. "Mommy, I have 2 sisters, Colton said. I put down my pen. Sonia didn't. She kept on working. Colton repeated himself. "Mommy, I have 2 sisters. Sonia looked up from her paperwork and shook her head slightly. "No, you have your sister Cassie, and do you mean your cousin Tracy?" "No," Colton clipped off the word adamantly. "I have 2 sisters. You had a baby die in your tummy, didn't you?" At that moment, time stopped in the Burbo household, and Sonia's eyes grew wide. Just a few seconds before Colton had been trying unsuccessfully to get his mom to listen to him. Now, even from the kitchen table, I could see that he had her undivided attention. "Who told you I had a baby die in my tummy?" Sonia asked, her tone serious. "She did, Mommy. She said she died in your tummy." Then Colton turned and started to walk away. He had said what he had to say and was ready to move on. But after the bomb he just dropped, Sonia was just getting started. Before our son could get around the couch, Sonia's voice rang out in an all-hands-on-deck red alert. "Colton Todd Burpo, you get back here right now." Colton spun around and caught my eye. His face said, "What did I just do?" I knew what my wife had to be feeling. Losing that baby was the most painful event of her life. We had explained it to Cassie. She was older, but we hadn't told Colton, judging the topic a bit beyond a 4-year-old's capacity to understand. From the table, I watched quietly as emotions rioted across Sonia's face. A bit nervously, Colton slunk back around the couch and faced his mom again, this time much more warily. "It's okay, Mommy," he said. "She's okay. God adopted her." Sonia slid off the couch and knelt down in front of Colton so that she could look him in the eyes. "Don't you mean Jesus adopted her?" she said. "No, Mommy. His dad did." Sonia turned and looked at me. In that moment, she later told me she was trying to stay calm, but she was overwhelmed. Our baby is a girl, she thought. Sonia focused on Colton, and I could hear the effort it took to steady her voice. So what did she look like? She looked a lot like Cassie, Colton said. She is just a little bit smaller, and she has dark hair. Sonia's dark hair. As I watched, a blend of pain and joy played across my wife's face. Cassie and Colton have my blonde hair. She had even jokingly complained to me before, I carried these kids for 9 months and they both come out looking like you. Now there was a child who looked like her, a daughter. I saw the first hint of moisture glint in my wife's eyes. Now Colton went on without prompting. In heaven, this little girl ran up to me and she wouldn't stop hugging me. He said in a tone that clearly indicated he didn't enjoy all this hugging from a girl. Maybe she was just happy that someone from her family was there, Sonia offered. Girls hug. When we're happy, we hug. Colton didn't seem convinced. Sonia's eyes lit up and she asked, what was her name? What was the little girl's name? Colton seemed to forget about all the yucky girl hugs for a moment. She doesn't have a name. You guys didn't name her. How did he know that? You're right, Colton, Sonia said. We didn't even know she was a she. Then Colton said something that still rings in my ears. Yeah, she said she just can't wait for you and Daddy to get to heaven. From the kitchen table, I could see that Sonia was barely holding it together. She gave Colton a kiss and told him he could go play. And when he left the room, tears spilled over her cheeks. Our baby's okay, she whispered. Our baby is okay. From that moment on, the wound from one of the most painful episodes in our lives, losing a child we had wanted very much, began to heal. For me, losing the baby was a terrible blow, but Sonia had told me that to her, the miscarriage not only seared her heart with grief, but it also felt like a personal failure. You do all the right things, eat all the right things, and you pray for the baby's health, but still this tiny baby dies inside you. She had once told me, I feel guilty. I know in my mind that it wasn't my fault, but there's still this guilt. We had wanted to believe that our unborn child had gone to heaven, even though the Bible is largely silent on this point, or at least it seems so to some. We had accepted it on faith, but now we had an eyewitness, a daughter we had never met was waiting eagerly for us in eternity. From then on, Sonia and I began to joke about who would get to heaven first. There were several reasons she had always wanted to outlive me. For one thing, a pastor's wife has to put up with being used as a sermon illustration a lot. If I died first, she's always told me she'd finally get to tell the congregation all her stories about me. But now Sonia had a reason for wanting to reach heaven first. She was pregnant with the child. When she was pregnant with the child we lost, we had picked out a boy's name, Colton, but we never could agree on a name for a little girl. I liked Kelsey, she liked Caitlin, and neither of us would budge. But now that we know our little girl doesn't have a name yet, we constantly tell each other, I'm gonna beat you to heaven and name her first.